The Return of Hope. David stood at the edge of Lily's grave, the cold wind biting at his face. It had been a year since he last came here. The flowers laid on the small marble stone were dry, brittle, and brown, much like the heart he had once offered to God. It had been a year since she was gone, and in that time, David had lost not only his daughter, but also his faith. Lily had been the light of his life, full of joy, laughter, and innocent questions about heaven, God, and angels. She was only 7 when the illness came. It struck so fast, there wasn't even time to ask why. One moment, she was laughing, running in the garden with Sarah, and the next, she was lying in a hospital bed, pale and weak. David prayed. He prayed like he had never prayed before. He pleaded with God to heal her, to bring her back to her bubbly self. He bargained. He offered up his own life if it meant Lily could live. But the miracle never came. Lily passed quietly in the night, leaving behind a house filled with broken dreams and unanswered prayers. Since then, David had walked away from God, away from the life of faith he once held so dearly. How could a loving God allow such pain? Where was his goodness when David needed him most? These questions haunted him daily, pushing him further into despair. Months passed, and Sarah continued going to church, quietly praying for David, who now avoided anything to do with God. Sarah never pushed him, never preached. She simply loved him as best she could, with her own heart still aching. She saw the pain in his eyes, felt the weight of his silence, but she knew healing would come in time. One evening, while sitting alone in the quiet of their empty home, David received a phone call from an old friend, Pastor James. The two hadn't spoken much since Lily's death, but Pastor James had known Lily well, having often come to their house to pray with the family during her illness. "David," the pastor's voice was gentle, "I've been thinking of you. I know things have been hard, and I want you to know I'm here. No preaching, no judgment, just here if you need to talk." David almost hung up, but hesitated. He hadn't cried in months, but now the dam was breaking. "I don't know what to believe anymore," David finally whispered. "I prayed for a miracle. I believed God would save her, and he didn't. How do I trust him after that?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then James spoke softly. "David, I can't pretend to have all the answers. I don't know why Lily wasn't healed, but I do know this. God never stopped loving you, and he never stopped loving her." David's heart ached at the words, wanting to believe them, but afraid of more disappointment. Before ending the call, James invited David to come to church one Sunday, not for answers, but just to be among people who cared for him. Weeks passed before David finally accepted the invitation. He sat at the back, far from the familiar pew he once shared with his family. The service wasn't anything spectacular, but something in the pastor's message caught David's attention. The pastor spoke of suffering, how even Jesus, God's own son, had wept and grieved. "We may never understand why some prayers seem to go unanswered," the pastor said, "but our suffering doesn't mean God has abandoned us. He is with us in the pain, holding us even when we don't feel his presence." David felt a lump rise in his throat. Could it be that God was still with him, even in his doubt? Could it be that, even now, God was holding him in his brokenness? One afternoon, David found himself back at the cemetery. He knelt by Lily's grave, tears streaming down his face. This time, he didn't ask God for answers. He didn't demand a reason. He simply whispered, "God, I'm still hurting. I don't understand, but I want to trust you again. Help me." The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying a quiet sense of peace that David hadn't felt in a long time. He knew the road to healing would be long, but for the first time in over a year, he felt a glimmer of hope. As David stood to leave, he felt the weight of something heavy but no longer unbearable. He knew now that he didn't have to carry it alone. And though his faith had been shaken, he realized it had not been lost. It was still there, buried beneath the grief, waiting for him to return. Epilogue. In the months that followed, David slowly returned to the church. He found comfort in the prayers of others and in Sarah's quiet but steadfast love. His faith wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, scarred by pain, but more resilient. David learned that faith didn't protect him from suffering, but it did give him a foundation on which to rebuild when everything else fell apart. And though Lily was gone from his sight, he believed more than ever that she was with God, and one day he would see her again. Until then, he would hold on to the hope that had once seemed lost but had now returned.